Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Pop It Like It's Hot. As always, we are sponsored by RIW Hobbies and Games and are recording live on location in scenic Livonia, Michigan. My name's Chris. I'm one of your co-hosts.
I'm Nick.
Dave.
Other Nick.
I'm Cameron.
And Brian.
And Brian, I think you had a message you wanted to get out to our listeners.
Yeah, so before we get to the fun Pauper Goods stuff, we had kind of a tragedy here in the Michigan Magic gaming community. A close friend of mine, Stuart Parnes. I've played lots of Magic with this guy. I've known him for like 15 years. I've probably played like 15 different team events with him. A close friend of mine. His wife tragically passed away on Monday, and there's a GoFundMe campaign, and anything you can do to sort of help out with help him in his time of need here. There's links to it on Facebook, and we have one on the Pop It Like It's Hot.
The website and the Facebook.
And the Facebook. So
And the Twitch stream.
And the Twitch stream. So anything you guys can do, open your hearts and lend a hand to a fellow gamer in a time of need would be much appreciated.
Yeah,
so,
we're going to get all those links out to you. So, yeah, like you said, anything you can do, we'd appreciate it. That said, we're going to get right into the show. Got a lot to talk about today. One bit of news, GP Portland was kind of unceremoniously announced as a standard event, so the Pauper GP is dead for at least this year.
For the time being, we'll see.
For the time being.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting challenge this week. I don't know, you want to get into some of the list we saw?
Yeah, it felt kind of like a strange challenge, at least as far as familiar names. Some people that were like a bit older were showing up for this one, and some of the ones that we've seen on a regular basis the last few months were not playing as often, and not to mention the results. I don't know if anybody else was as surprised by those as I was.
Absolutely. Red Deck won? I don't think anybody really would have called that. It did have some high variance. It won the challenge, and the next highest placing was 20th. Cam, what do you think about that?
I just think it means that the deck has can have really good draws where it wins the tournament just by playing a bunch of Burning Tree emissaries, or it can mean that the deck, or it can just do nothing and die on turn 4 because it doesn't cast the spells, or it doesn't cast enough spells, or something like that.
I think the mono blue fairies deck, right? It was mono blue. And
Yeah, it was in the
red
finals
deck
with them.
wins
Yep.
They're pretty favored against the slower, dirtier decks.
It seems that way. Like Tempo kind of took the top 2 spots anyway, at least for
maybe
this.
what are sideboards looking like? Are they weak to these decks, perhaps? And now it's time to consider. I love the red deck. I never feel like I'm out of it, especially if everyone's on Tron and they're setting up. I think I like to see the Spellsetter Sprite starting to get interjected into these Ephemerate decks. So I think that's a trend that, originally we saw Astrolabe take on, and then we saw Ephemerate, kind of the new cool kid. Now I think adding fairies into that whole mix is the shift we're seeing. I don't know if that plays into the aggro decks doing well, but...
It could be. I don't know. Cam, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting that there's only one person that ever does well with Mono Blue Delver.
Yeah.
It's Metzel.
Absolutely.
And I never see it ever in the challenge results except for Metzel. And yeah.
Yeah, it's always hard to make any overall metagame calls based on Metzel doing well in a challenge with Mono Blue Delver. I talked to him. He said he's been playing that deck since Storm was a thing in Pauper, and he said his big change to adapt to the new meta was adding 2 dispels to the sideboard. So clearly this guy's on to something with the deck. He's as seasoned a pro with that deck as anybody on any deck. He's also been adding Force Spike to his list, which is interesting. I think that could see more play, in my opinion. Brian, what do you think?
I mean, Force Spike's not really a card that I'm ever excited to play with, but it's a role player where when it has a job to do, there's a time for Force Spike. I mean, even I've played Mana Tithe before, like in Slivers and stuff like that. Like, it's definitely a good spell when you're trying to leverage your mana against decks that aren't as efficient as you are. So Force Spike, but the one that I've really noticed seeing a lot more play is Dispel, even in like main decks
Yeah.
and stuff. And I think that that's really smart.
I'm never sorry to see a Dispel in my hand lately.
Well, especially with Ephemerate, just being able to take that out, because Ephemerate's just like a 2-for-1 waiting to happen for 1 mana. It's so busted.
2-for-1 with a Muldrifter. It's like a 6-for-1 or something.
Well,
like
I mean,
that.
at the least, it's going to be a 2-for-1.
Yeah.
It's often like much more. So
Yeah. I think also it kind of felt like, at least with Delver and maybe to some extent with Red Deck Wins, that decks that just weren't on people's radars were able to take advantage of sort of a blind spot in the meta, and people obviously weren't prepared for those particular decks, and maybe that's part of what, in addition to his like high experience with the deck, Metzel was able to sort of take advantage of.
I think it's hard to say that Red Deck Wins wasn't on people's radar when it won the last challenge or the challenge before that.
Sure.
The last challenge was Stompy, so
The challenge before that.
okay, gotcha. Another deck that's kind of been making itself known. I know they played it in the Premier League. Entropy's been playing a lot of it. Is Familiars. A Familiars list made the top 8, and then there was an Esper Familiars list in the 5-0 list for this week. They've been adding Moments Peace and Ephemerate. They're kind of, it's like an amalgam between Tron and Familiars that we're seeing now.
Well, I think it, in part, is just a way to abuse the Archaeomancer Ephemerate interaction as quickly as possible, just to get all those things down and reduce the mana cost so you can try to combo people out and lock them out of the game. Because I think one of the lists, maybe the one from the PPL, was running Temporal Spring, and I was kind of surprised not to see it in the list that made the top 8. But just the power of Archaeomancer Ephemerate, and possibly Ephemerate in general, seems to be really shining through for a lot of these lists.
That's really the story, isn't it?
I'm actually not familiar with that deck. What is the payoff for playing all of the familiars? What is the deck doing?
It's similar to Tron in that you're trying to loop Ghostly Flickers and Mnemonic Walls and bring back, like you said, Temporal Spring and lock people out of the game.
Okay, sweet. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then like the slightly older FAMs lists, essentially we're abusing the mana reduction from the familiar in order to get some kind of infinite loop going, either with Flicker Wall plus like an island to gain infinite life, or if there's a creature in play, I think Sage Road Denizen, you could mill your opponent out as well. So just trying to get to that point where they can do an infinite Flicker loop.
Okay, cool.
Kind of the last thing we wanted to talk about, I guess, for the challenge is the reappearance of some classic archetypes that have sort of been not dead, but maybe hibernating is the word we'll go with. You saw Elves. We talked about Mono Blue. Burn top 8'd the last challenge, and we saw it again in the top 16 this week. There was an Aristocrats list in 12th place. Cam, we know the guy that had the
Yeah.
Aristocrats list.
Yeah, it's Gabe Cruz. He was a local grinder. He moved away a week ago, and yeah,
Real excited to see Gabe in 12th place. That was good job, Gabe.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, just a lot of decks that seem to be kind of like what I was saying, like creeping into a blind spot maybe in the mid, or at least caught people unawares, because we had been seeing a ton of Weather Storm, and at least from some of the lists I've been looking over, it's been showing up a little bit less in sideboards or main decks, so maybe giving some of these other decks a spot to kind of sneak in and make a statement.
Yeah, you sometimes see people cheating on sideboard slots. Like, for instance, there was a time when everybody was running 2 Gorilla Shamans just to hate out Affinity. And now maybe you're seeing fewer people play Electrickery, and you see things like Mono Blue and Elves making a comeback. So I'm not positive that that's what it is, but that's kind of the ebb and flow you see in lists for tournaments like the Challenge.
How many people play in the challenge each week on MTGO? Can you hear me?
It varies a little bit. Cam, did you wanna-
about 60 or 70 usually.
So
Somewhere in there.
like if you take an off meta, like a semi off meta deck, like Mono Blue Delver is right now, like Boggles, like it could just be that like only 2 people felt like playing it, right?
Yeah,
So like these decks could still be good,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
but it's just people just don't feel like playing it, or MTGO clicking prevents them from doing it or whatever.
There's also like an element of like, if you just get good pairings, like any deck can be insane depending
Yeah.
on what you play against, you know? Like if you're just putting people to the test with red deck or whatever, and you aren't playing against a bunch of Weather the Storm decks, like you could very easily just rattle off 6 wins in a row and
But
get
yeah,
top
that's
8.
that's like how whenever I go to a 1K, I play mono black and never face Tron, so it feels great.
Must be nice. Must be nice. So I guess that can lead us a little bit into our next topic, and what we wanted to talk about is, since the blue bands and unification and Modern Horizons giving us a lot of new toys for some of these greedier decks, we've been seeing the meta shift kind of towards those. I know personally in leagues, I'm seeing a lot of Jeskai, I'm seeing a lot of Tron, I'm seeing a lot of decks that are trying to go deep, trying to go late, and it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of the counterpoint to these decks previously were some of these really fast Gush decks that had a turn 3 combo, for instance, that would kind of keep them in check for their early stumbles.
Yeah, some of the natural predators, I guess, in the metagame for some of these late game big mana decks have just essentially vanished. It's kind of left them without really a strong counterpoint, except for maybe aggro decks just trying to get in underneath.
Yeah, and some of these decks, for example, are the Tireless Tribe combo that used Gush to increase the amount of cards in its hand and go off for 20 with, one inside out. Or is it Blitz, which would, really heavily rely on cards like Ataxian Probe and free spells like Gush to rattle off a bunch of spells in one turn and kill you with a Kiln Fiend?
Can I talk about Kiln Fiend?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I have a vendetta against this deck because it killed off the playgroup at my first LGS. I have a vendetta against this deck because it killed off the playgroup at my first LGS because 3 of my friends brought it and then no one showed up the week after. But I don't think that Gush and Gataxian Probe are actually that much of a loss for it because there's a bunch of free spells that no one's tried out. So there's Thunderclap, which bolts only a creature. You sack a mountain, I think. Fire Blast, Manamorphose, Slip Through Space, just more burn spells so you could play like Chain Lightning. And then I think that a lot of the decks in the format are just net decks that get 80% of the way there and no one innovates enough.
Well, so kind of...
It's funny you should say that, Nick.
Indeed.
Because what we wanted to get into is that people now are seeing this dearth of combo decks in the format, and they're going back to the drawing board, and they're trying to come up with new, innovative ways to bring this archetype of decks back.
Yeah. But, yeah, I don't think that losing Gataxian Probe and Gush necessarily makes the deck Kiln Fiend unplayable.
Whether it makes it unplayable or not, people
I think people
playing
are just
it.
giving up
Right.
on it too soon, yeah.
Fair enough.
That's possible, but I mean, from some of the people that seem to be brewing combo decks to fill that niche that had been empty, maybe we'll see somebody come up with a different,
Because
Fist of
Bolt,
Flame.
an alternative. Yeah.
Yeah.
because
Nobody's tried
Bolt,
that.
Teamer Battle Rage, and Mutagenic Growth is still 27 damage.
Very much so.
I think
well-
Fist of Flame has not seen its day yet, and we're gonna. That's a
It's
hell of a
possible.
card, I think. You're like, Brainstorm. What is it on a Kiln Fiend? +5 if you do that and draw a card per turn. Like,
Something like that. Well, Brainstorm itself is just +3, but I mean,
yeah, draw a card, and the card says draw a card.
you still have
Plus
plenty
the
of
Kiln Fiend is 3.
sure. You
so,
still have plenty of cheap cantrips and stuff.
Yeah.
There's also Rakdos where you just give the Kiln Fiend Infect and then pump it with Mutagenic Growth and kill in one swing. Or like Immolating Soul Eater. So I've seen that too. It's pretty good.
Awesome.
Well, I know I'm a big fan of Tribe, and I was sad to see Gush go because it worked really well with that interaction. But one of the cool cards that I've seen people like teching and building with is Whiteout. It's kind of a innocuous green common from Ice Age that allows you to sack Snowlands to get it back from your hand, sort of mitigating the loss of Gush as sort of this 4-for-1 or 3+3 spell. So it's a really neat innovation that I guess some of the Brazilian grinders online noticed and have started to like brew with and come up with some stuff. And I think, Chris, you actually ran into some of these guys as well online.
Yeah, I was talking to Ricardo Matana, who's in the PPL with you, Brian, and he was telling me kind of about their play group in Brazil. I guess they have a WhatsApp chat where they just sort of brew decks and iterate different decks to come up with the best build. And Paulo Cabral, he was on the 5-0 list this week with his Tribe deck,
Can you look this up?
he innovated this Whiteout Tribe deck that I mean, he's putting up results with it already. I think they were kind of trying to keep it under wraps until after the challenge this week, but it didn't really end up making too many waves in the challenge. But like I said, he 5-0'd with it. The deck looks really awesome. I've played a few leagues with it, not to the success of Paulo, but I enjoyed it. Whiteout seemed like a total house. It not only lets you deal 20, but if you need to deal 30 or 40 damage after a Weather the Storm, later in the game you can sack 6 or 7 lands, dump your hand, and deal all the damage you need to. So it's been really cool.
Oh yeah, and we're also seeing some of the different color combinations maybe than what we're used to with Tribe, because there was that green-white Tribe by Ferrodin and a few challenges back playing Treefolk Umbra. So taking advantage of the fact that that's sort of protecting the toughness, and you don't actually have to like weaken yourself to burn or something like that.
Yeah, like a week ago when you asked me for the infinite life guys, I was like, oh, what's Nick up to now? Like, I didn't know about this card, and I'm like, how do you make the toughness kill them? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's well, I guess the person that I know who's been working on that is Kung Fu Trees, another online grinder who has 5-0'd a couple of times, I think, with this list, combining Nomad's Encore and Daru Spiritualist to generate infinite toughness, and then either Inside Out or Treefolk Umbra to flip it around and deal infinite damage.
I have a question about 2 cards in Tireless Tribe. What about Fathom Seer, the Gush on a stick, and what about Ideas Unbound, which is 2 blue to draw 3, then discard 3 at the end of your turn?
I've seen people trying those online. It doesn't seem to have put up any kind of consistent results as far as like Challenger 5-0s. Not to say that it's not abusable, but at least to this point, we haven't seen anyone really be able to take advantage of it consistently.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with somebody about Fathom Seer earlier today, and I think the big drawback there is that Whiteout and Gush are both free spells in this situation.
Yeah.
Whereas you have to pay the morph cost on Fathom Seer. It's basically you pay 3 to play it face down, and you return 2 islands to your hand to draw 2 cards. So it gives you the same card advantage, I guess, as Gush does, but paying that initial
It actually
3
costs 3 mana.
Right, it's a little bit tougher when you're trying to combo off as quick as you can.
Yeah.
Also, the neat part is there's no like mana investment for sort of storing, so to speak, damage for later. So you can just discard Whiteout, leave it in your graveyard, and build up lands. Just like how with Gush, you could play one early and then just keep cards in your hand, generating mana and card advantage. Did you have something, Cam?
No.
Yeah, kind of on your same point. It helps to be able to get a free discard essentially on that Whiteout to dodge an early scred or something when you're trying to stick a Tireless Tribe, which can be difficult when people can scred for 3 on turn 2 or something like that.
Well, I was going to ask you guys, how do you guys try to brew? Like, when you're trying to come up with new lists that you want to play, if a ban happens or if just the deck you're playing doesn't seem to be cutting it anymore, what do you guys do to come up with new decks?
I don't brew. I copy lists. That is the one skill that I have not been able to get good at, and it's not a skill that I've necessarily wanted to get good at because it's not a necessary skill a lot of the time. So I just copy lists.
Net decking, as old as Magic itself.
Brian, you've probably brewed a few decks in your time, huh?
Yeah, so I actually brew quite a bit, but I'm actually a very metric-driven Magic player. Like I observe trends, I observe numbers, and I try and get a sense of what's going on and what decks are well positioned. Generally, when I'm brewing, it's because like I'll notice a deck that I think is well positioned, and I'll play it, and there's something I don't like about it. Like I'll notice like I just don't like the way this deck, like I admit this deck's powerful, it's good, but like there are things I don't like about it, and then like I'll sort of like try and figure out what I don't like, and then figure out how to make it something I would like. So like for instance, I played Affinity last week, I did pretty well with it, I went 3-0, but like it was like this deck is so clunky. Like I have way too many things that cost like 2 mana, I have too many like things that are only going to be good in a certain situation. So I like went back and like I tried out different variations of like I did a search. I found all of the cards that have like affinity for artifact, interact with artifacts in every color combination, and made a little chart. And then like went through and tried to find what were the most mana efficient ones. And I tried out some different stuff. I did like a blue-white one. I had like a red-green one. I tried out a bunch of different stuff. So That's generally what I do. I take decks that already exist, sort of think about what their weaknesses are in the metagame, and then try and like craft them in such a way that they shore up their weaknesses and do something a little bit different.
So using metrics is kind of interesting. Are there like particular resources you'll go to, like certain websites, or do you have like your own kind of data sets you work off of?
The two that I really like are MTG Top 8 and MTG Goldfish. I like MTG Top 8 much more than Goldfish, but Goldfish actually has more data on it. But it's hard. Goldfish, I think, is like a little bit more awkward to navigate. Like the decks all have different names. Like it'll be like Wooburg Control, and then you click on it and it's Tron, and you're like, come on, guys, like just say Tron. And there, you don't have as much like leniency with like how you want to search if you want to search for specific things. But the thing I like doing, and this is how I try and figure out what the best decks are, if you go on Goldfish and a deck is like 12% of the metagame, and then you go to MTG Top 8 and it's like 4% of the winner's metagame, you know that deck stinks because it's like a big chunk of the metagame and it doesn't convert. But when you find decks that are like 4% of the metagame and then like 4% of the top 8, those are decks that are actually really well positioned. So those are like the decks I'm always looking for. That's how I found Stompy.
That's interesting.
It was like it was like the same percentage of the winner's metagame as it was the metagame at large. So it's like, well, it seems like everybody's getting paid off for playing this.
For sure.
So
Anybody else have any?
I'll brew and I'll totally swing and miss a lot, but I'll like dive deep. Like recently, I was like, all right, I'm gonna search all the cards with Metalcraft for, you know, if you have 3 or more artifacts, they get boosted what they're doing because of Astrolabe. I'm like, okay, maybe there's some buried treasure I can find that nobody's utilized yet. But I'll use Gatherer, search up like not Pauper related, but I kind of wanted to brew a deck where it was like if anybody gains life, they'll lose that much life, like that effect. So I'll like have a very specific search on Gatherer, like all cards that have this type of effect, or like I'll look at Card Kingdom too sometimes because they'll show you like somebody who bought this also bought this, so that can kind of start the trail of breadcrumbs of somebody tried this type of thing, and
Sure.
it just spirals out of.
I
You get a
like
giant
using-
notebook of possibilities, and then you're like, okay, if I go this way, I can't get the payoffs over here. Like it kind of shows you. Yeah, I say this with a notebook of like, maniac scientist notes. of what I'm
Dave
talking.
brought his brewing book, so
Yeah.
we get to see inside the mind of this crazy individual.
Right.
the
There's
same thing.
not
I do.
much
I do
there.
charts. Like there's so many cards. Like you can't just have a bunch of free floating ideas in your head. You gotta like.
Yeah.
There's too many to. You gotta write them down and.
Oh yeah.
Figure out how to
Mine'll
balance
be
them
like
out.
at least a whole page of possibilities, and then like you'll see the non-bows, and you're like, okay. And I don't like building too much based on only synergy. Like I think some people go too far deep and say, oh, it doesn't have the keyword I'm building around, so I can't play it. It's like, at a certain point, you got to play the most powerful stuff, and the synergies complement it, but don't be so like focused on that as the one building thing. But like this right here, I was looking at a list, and I didn't even know about this Snow Fairies deck, and I just wanted Skyfisher in Fairies. So I started with the list after I found out about it, and was like, okay, well, here's what I don't like. I want to take Glinthawk out. I want to cut Galv Blast because I don't want to run artifact lands, and I want to cut Journey. And then I just kind of pushed and pulled a little bit. So it's most of it there is I know it's already successful in a way, so I'm not starting
So
from
you're,
zero.
you're iterating a deck that you've seen and just kind of making
Yeah.
it what you want it to be.
Yeah, this is definitely a tweak.
Great. Well, kind of going back to the original point we had before we talked about brewing, and that was very valuable information, guys. I appreciate it. The reason people are trying to tune these combo decks is because there are a lot of greedy decks in the format right now. The greediest of which is, what some people are calling the most powerful deck in the format. It's Tron. Everybody loves it or hates it. There's no middle ground with a deck like Tron. So I think we wanted to go a little bit deeper on the different varieties of Tron. Strengths and weaknesses. I know we're gonna have a lot of different thoughts on this deck. I see Nick is already bursting at the seams.
Can I
to
say something about brewing before we go to Tron?
Sure.
like I said earlier, like a lot of the decks are just net decks that get 80% of the way there. So like a lot of you don't even have to come up with your own deck. You can just take a net deck and then try to improve it. And that's basically what I do. That's what I did with Mono Black. And that I think it's also possible that net decking in such a small format is circular. So if you don't play a deck because it doesn't see representation, and other people also do that, and there's only like a few dozen people playing the format at any time, like the deck might be good, but just no one plays it, right? So
Yeah, so there's like diamonds in the rough waiting to be mined, that kind of thing.
yeah, but
Definitely.
everyone else is waiting for everyone else to try it out.
Sure.
But no one does. So.
Sure.
Oh, Pester. Or
Well, a lot of people think playing the best deck will make give you the best chance to win, but like a lot of times, if a lot of people are converging on that same point, it's like a race to the middle because you're just going to be playing a bunch of mirror matches, you know.
yeah.
Plus, like if you're just jumping in, like Tron is like the best deck or whatever, it's the most winning deck right now. If you're just jumping on the Tron wagon, you're so far behind the people who got Tron to the top in the first place that it's going to be an uphill battle for you. You're going to have a bunch of 50-50 matchups, and you're going to be an underdog in the mirror.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that like people tend to like gravitate toward the hot deck, but a lot of times it actually pays off to gravitate away from the hot deck and just play the deck that beats the hot deck.
Yeah.
Sure.
Metagaming
Well-
in a nutshell.
Cam, do you want to get into a little bit of the reasons that Tron is the hot deck and seems like it has been forever, and I never want to see it again? But anyway,
Yeah, I guess the Tron lands themselves, they just create so much more mana than your opponent, and it uses cards like Moment's Peace to get to the point where it's in the end game, where it can use that extra mana to its advantage, and it uses cards like Ghostly Flicker and Ephemerate on Mnemonic Wall to generate a ton of advantage.
okay. So, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, we've kind of seen a couple of different, well, I guess a few different ways to abuse that and, like, follow that strategy. Some leaning more into the, like, high power, maybe high variance kind of openings, and then others kind of trying to go for a more middle ground of consistency, and then others just trying to play big fatties with the bunch of mana that Tron generates. So it's interesting that even within this one archetype, there's quite a bit of variability and options you can go with.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, looking at a list like Hellsow's list that runs 4 Stonehorn Dignitaries, and then looking at, like you said, a list like what we call Fangren Tron, it's just trying to rush out an Ulamog's Crusher. They run a lot of the same cards, but they are not the same deck by any means. And yeah, I guess the two main flavors of Tron that I'm seeing, at least in leagues right now, are championed by two people that if you've played any amount of Magic Online and Pauper, you'd probably recognize. There's Birdman263, who runs what I call Mono Blue Tron. He calls it Combo Tron. I don't know if anybody's really settled on a name for it yet. But it's more of the consistent list that you talked about. It's running Impulses. It's running...
A ton of flashback spells, so you get just card advantage in one spell on its own.
Absolutely. He says Mystical Teachings is the thing that sets his deck apart. He really abuses that. And then on the other side of the coin, you have what I call Hellsow Tron, Stonehorn Tron, that it can be a little clunkier. It's not running quite the same card draw engine that the Impulse list runs, but like I said, it runs 4 Stonehorn Dignitaries, and the goal of this deck is to just lock the opponent out of combat as soon as possible. The best hands with Stonehorn Tron are pretty much unbeatable, but it doesn't always quite get there.
Yeah, he's certainly cut a lot of the things that make Birdman's Tron or Entropy's Tron more consistent, so he doesn't have as many maps. He's running fewer of these like kind of intermediary draw spells or cantrips like Impulse, so he's just kind of relying on hitting Tron somewhat organically as the game progresses, or maybe even keeping his converted mana cost a little bit lower, perhaps, to some extent. And just having this game plan of shutting out aggro decks and shutting out any kind of combat step that it's really hard to interact with, really hard to get around, even with hate and removal. So I know even between Cam and I, we both like playing Tron a lot at our LGS tournaments, and we kind of differ in terms of how we interpret that deck and what preferences we have as far as what cards to play and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I tend to play Birdman's Tron just because I like the consistency of it. I really like being able to cast my spells on time, even if it means that I might have a worse nut draw or a worse just early game because I'm not playing Stonehorn Dignitary necessarily. I just like the consistency of it.
Well, actually, there was one card we were talking about earlier, Rolling Thunder, that has kind of popped in and out of the lists online a bit, and I know you're a big fan of it. Did you want to maybe explain why you feel that way about it?
Yeah, I think if you're a fast enough player online that it's not a card that you want to play because it's just a win condition basically. It can sometimes be a plague win, but a lot of the time it's just a win condition. I just like it because it's a really fast win condition. You're not always, but a lot of the time when you're ahead, you're going to have enough mana to Rolling Thunder them like maybe once or twice with a Ghostly Flicker and a Mnemonic Wall to get it back. And I just like the card a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely a faster win condition than something like Compulsive Research that, you have to cast that a whole lot of times.
Or attacking with Mole Drifter.
Right, or Din Rova Horror or Capsize or what have you. It's definitely, leveraging the once you get to 22 mana with 2 red sources, you can just kill your opponent right then.
Yeah. For me, I kind of like some of the lines that Hellsow's list has taken, where he's thinning out cards that in the mid to late game are a little deader. Drawing Expedition Map when you already have Tron and when you've already fetched a lot of your utility lands can be annoying because it's essentially a dead draw. But he's got a ton of thinning, like Ash Barrens, which you draw the one Expedition Map and you grab an Ash Barrens and thin out. So it's like 3 cards that you don't have to draw anymore that are out of your deck for 1 card.
I disagree that's irrelevant. That's that relevant. I think he's playing it because it's mana fixing, and if the slight amount of thinning that it gives is mostly irrelevant, in my opinion.
I mean, I've seen. I guess it's anecdotal, but I feel like I've had plenty of games where I've hit number of Ash Barrens in the early game, got to the point where I'm kind of locking my opponent and just wanting to draw, the win cons, or wanting to draw the better spells. And it felt like having fewer lands from that was beneficial. But again, it's more my experience playing it as opposed to
Well, I think the answer in Birdman's list there is Mystical Teachings. Instead of, thinning your deck to get to the cards that you need, you just go get them.
Sure.
You pay 4 mana and get whatever you want.
He's only got 1 more Mystical Teachings. 2 to 1, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's a pretty significant difference. You're going to see it a lot more often with 2 copies instead of 1, especially with all the extra card draws in the deck.
I think tutors are good, and Pauper players should play as many of them as they can.
Yeah, we don't have many, so we probably want to use as many of the good ones as we possibly can. Another big difference is just the number of snowlands each of them chooses to play. One thing that I like about Entropy's lists is that he gets to play the actual card counterspell because he's running so many islands, and I think it's probably harder for Hellsow's list to get counterspell online, so he's stuck with Prohibit because the multiple blue can be a little clunky, I guess. And
he's not playing cards like Condescend, which are not the greatest cards.
Yeah, I played a handful of games before the cast, and the first thing I noticed was this deck needs 1 counterspell in it for sure.
It's just hard to cast.
Yeah, it was I was trying to get up, play around Gray Merchant is how my opponent's going to win, and it's just Prohibit is not going to get the job done here. This needs to be a counterspell.
Counterspell was a power
Hellsaw's list has 4 Ghostly Flicker.
Yeah, he's
just
way
throw
more
the
heavily
first
in on
2.
flickers, which
to draw.
that's another innovation that I kind of liked, because then you can burn through those early in the game without worrying about them getting eaten by bogs or something along those lines.
So, I think that what makes Tron, and Pauper isn't the big mana, because in formats like Modern, you're trying to rush out a turn 3 Karn, right?
Absolutely.
So there's not, what are you going to do? Rush out Ulamog's Crusher, it'll just die to Doomblade, right? So I think what makes the Tron decks Tron and Pauper is Ghostly Flicker, Displace, and Ephemerate. So I really separate the Tron decks into 2 types of Tron decks. There's Flicker Tron decks, and then there's everything else that has kind of a fair game plan. like Finger and Marauder and Eggs, or like Ristic Circle Tron, or just like putting like just Olimog's Crusher, Wretched Griff, Colorless Tron.
It was even the Snowtron that was just kind of trying to abuse the
Yeah, just like
Arkham's
play Core
Astrolabe
Skyfisher and then
Glinthawk,
burn
yeah.
with like Fireball or something. I think those are somewhat reasonable. I think it's mostly Ghostly Flicker and those like the double Flicker cards, and that there's more of I see more of the similar. So Jeskai Ephemerate and like Flickertron is like basically they're just the same deck really, and they're more similar to each other than like Flickertron and like Fenrir Maraudertron is, I feel.
I can get behind that.
So
Because Jeskai Ephemerate is just Tronless Tron, right? So
the big thing about the mana in Tron is that it doesn't help necessarily in the early game. You're not playing a turn 3 card, but you are playing a turn 10 Ghostly Flicker 30 times.
yeah,
That's the big difference.
Yeah, being able to play multiple spells in turn. I mean, I myself have won when my opponent had the Archaeomancer Ephemerate counterspell lock because I was able to play more spells than they could counter, and that's kind of the line that Entropy advocates with his Tron deck is to just outspell decks like that.
But again, like you said, that it's because you can cast Ghostly Flicker 30 times. So if you just couldn't cast Ghostly Flicker, and you could just only cast like Olimog's Crusher or like a Firebolt Tribal, I think it'd be fine, right?
Well, even like some of the older Tron lists, because I think Tron was the first deck I tried to play when I got into Pauper about 3.5 years ago, and I was looking through some old lists of Trons, and they were a lot more controlling. So there was like more counter spells, more removal, which are both cards we don't see quite as often in the main decks of Tron decks. And they're still just abusing the mana to play multiple spells in a turn. So playing like a semi-fair game, not leaning as heavily on Ghostly Flicker and Mnemonic Wall and just looping a ton of spells. They're just playing more spells than what the opponent can. That's how they got there.
I'd also like to talk about tutors more too, because like I think if you just make your Tron deck immune to combat damage, then you don't have to play a hard counterspell, and you can just play Muddle the Mixture and tutor for Rolling Thunder, right?
That's an avenue, sure.
Or a tutor for sideboard cops, because what you're gonna do when I resolve cop blue?
Well, one of my sort of favorite developments in the format has been the introduction of Astrolabe to a lot of these Tron decks because it's allowed it to play more of these like multicolored spells and more of the the good stuff that you want to play with a Tron deck instead of having to lean heavily on signets and sort of these tap lands to like filter your mana.
Like back in my day, if you wanted to ramp mana in like a format like this, that's not, Moxes and all this going on, you played Rampant Growth, and then you did another effect like Fertile Ground, and then you did your thing. But like obviously the opportunity cost with Tron is your 12 colorless lands that can hose you. But yeah, with you just draw one island, or you draw into your Prophetic Prism, like it increases the consistency of, kind of mitigates that cost of deck building. Yeah.
Absolutely. Tron's main bottleneck has never been the amount of mana it has, but it's been the amount of colored sources it has, which sort of dictates how many spells it can play in a turn.
And that's like one of the biggest things that Astrolabe has brought, just more colored sources in the deck to cast as many spells as you can.
Absolutely. So, in the challenge this week, the fourth place list was a pretty interesting hybrid, I guess, of the two different types of Flickertron that we've talked about today. It was a guy by the name of Modern Monkey. I'm actually not familiar with him. I don't know that I've played against him, but we definitely looked at this list and we're like, wow, that's a really interesting take on it. What do you think makes this deck unique? Like, why do you think that made it to fourth place over some of the more established archetypes we've talked about?
I think the introduction of Stoneborn Dignitary into a Birdman Tron shell just adds more fogs, adds a way to get around Flaring Pain, adds a way to just a way to deal with another way to deal with combat in a more effective way, I guess.
And he takes advantage of a card that I haven't seen Hellcell use, and I like a lot in Weather the Storm. just buys you so much time against certain aggro decks.
Yeah.
Gets you out of any kind of danger zone that you would otherwise be in.
You can chain like 3, 4, 5 spells before you play Weather the Storm and gain 18 life very easily in that deck.
And that definitely just shuts the door on decks like Red Deck Wins, Burn, Stompy to a degree. A lot of these low-to-the-ground aggro decks we've been talking about. So that's it. How do you beat Tron? This is a question that I think is on everybody's mind. What does this deck lose to? It seems like it can do everything.
It loses to itself, and it loses to things that get under it.
So normally I'd be pessimistic about this, and well, my answer is kind of pessimistic, but there's two answers.
Now
there's,
is no
there's,
exception.
there's nothing, and just quit and cube, right? And then you could play Mill, right? Mill just ignores whatever Tron does.
Well, not
But then you get into
necessarily,
the
because
question.
A lot of Tron lists are running Mortuary Mire, so they can loop Flicker, Mnemonic Wall, and Mortuary Mire to never deck themselves.
Plus, Denrova Horror is another win condition that's been slotted into a lot of them recently.
Wait,
so
how are they not milling themselves again?
So you get a creature in the graveyard,
Okay.
you Ghostly Flicker, a Mnemonic Wall, and a Mortuary Mire. You take a creature from your graveyard when Mortuary Mire enters the battlefield, and you put it on top of your deck.
Okay.
Oh.
So you never end up with 0 cards in your library.
And then you just have to discard that creature at the end of your turn. So you have to make sure you have enough cards that you'll be discarding so that that same creature just gets put back on top of your deck forever.
I mean, I guess theoretically it's possible to mill a Tron player out, but they have fail-safes in place to make it very difficult.
Okay.
If you mill the
so-
mire, they can pulse back the
Yeah,
mire.
they can
pulse
pull some
back the
Marasa
Mire.
to get it back.
And that's been kind of the strength of this deck for quite a while now. Is just it's got all these different fail-safes and inevitabilities built in, so that if they can survive to have 15 mana on board, they almost have any option available to them as far as recouping lost cards and gaining an advantage and sealing the game.
So then my other answer was, well then, if Mill's better than Tron, then it's just a better version of Tron because it interacts even less, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, your assessment of it doesn't interact, I don't agree with. I feel like it interacts the most, up to a point until you're counter
What, Tron or
everything you do.
Mill?
Tron.
I think that, so the dictionary definition of interaction isn't playing lots of cards, it's reciprocal action or influence, and what Tron does is the exact opposite of that. No matter what you do, they always one-up you, right?
Absolutely. Well,
I guess.
So
but
it ceases to be reciprocal, right?
So we are kind of coming up on time here, and I wanted to make sure we had a chance to reiterate what we were saying at the top of the show. Before we do that, was there anything else anybody wanted to add on Tron, or we're all agreed that nobody should ever play it again?
To beat Tron, you
All
turn
right.
your boys sideways,
Well,
and then you just...
As powerful
they
as
got
it
it.
is, and even though I think it's probably the most powerful deck in the format, I still think there's room to get under it. There's enough time in the early game where it's setting up that there are other decks that can kind of beat it. So I see foils for it in the meta, which I like, and there's still people brewing and trying to come up with new tribe lists and stuff to take it out or to challenge its dominance currently as far as the most powerful deck. So.
It's also hard to beat Tron because the Tron decks do different things. So if you're playing Stompy, you'll beat some Tron decks, but you're gonna have a really hard time against the Stonehorn Dignitary version. Whereas if you play Burn and you play against the ones that are main decking the Weather the Storms instead of the Dignitary, so not only do you have to have a plan for Tron, but you also have to match up against the version of Tron that doesn't have the hedge to beat you, which is kind of awkward.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any deck that just beats Tron, in the abstract. But I think you guys are right. You really just want to have a focused plan of dealing a bunch of damage as quickly as possible. Hope they stumble a little bit and don't draw whatever their trump card is that wrecks you. Don't give them the time to tutor for it either.
Definitely.
Great.
Go
ahead, Nick.
So I disagree. I don't think there's any room to get under Tron unless you get lucky with one land spy. So I think that Magic players are in denial about what their best cards are. So I think with the guy that plays 4 Ghostly Flicker, he has the right idea because that's his best card. But they should play more Fogs and more Stonehorns. So if you just don't face any Stonehorn players, right? That's not really a fault with the deck. It's just them being too greedy to run Stonehorns, right, and flicker them.
I don't know if he could play. He plays 4, so I don't know if he's allowed to
He's
play any
playing
more than that.
4 Stonehorns.
Well, if you don't play the Stonehorn, if you play the Stonehorns, then like you're giving up slots against people in the mirror.
Okay,
You're going to
so
play against people.
never mind then. He is playing 4 Stonehorn, 4 Ghostly Flicker. So
He's being
this
just
seems
greedy enough for you, huh?
this seems just fine then.
Yeah, that's the list I was playing earlier today.
Like
It's great.
maybe you change it around a little bit, but like it seems.
Needs a counter spot.
Well, I guess.
Yeah, I don't understand what beats this then.
Yeah, me neither.
Well, we get to brewing, I think.
we get to brewing some combo. So hopefully you guys took some great lessons from our earlier conversation. Before we go, Brian, you want to just kind of reiterate what we were saying at the top of the show? It's an important issue here, and I want to make sure that we give it the time it deserves.
Yeah, absolutely. Local Magic player in the Michigan area, Stu Parnes. Wife tragically passed away over the weekend, so be sure to send him some love on social media. And if you are so inclined, there's a GoFundMe to sort of like try and help him out in his time of crisis here. So, check that out and help support a fellow Magic player.
Yeah, being a community is just as important as being good at Magic. So we're going to give you all the information you need to...
and we'll also, do we have the info on those tourneys as well? We don't have, so a bunch of the local Michigan stores are going to be running a tournament series as a benefit to his wife. So go ahead.
Or sorry, do we have a link to the GoFundMe on
We
the show
absolutely
notes
do,
or
yeah.
something?
We're gonna have those links everywhere. If you follow Pop It Like It's Hot on any platforms, Twitch, Facebook, Twitter, if you follow
Okay.
RIW, you're gonna find the links there. We're gonna make sure you can get that information. It'll be in the show notes. So yeah, whatever you can do, even if it's just thinking the best for him, we want to make sure that he gets the help that he needs in a tough time for everybody.
You should probably spell his name out for people in the car, because I know how I am with podcasts. I always forget to check the show notes because I'm driving.
Sure,
So-
it's STUARTPARNES.
Okay.
There you go.
Oh, and I just wanted to say thank you guys for welcoming me. I'm going to be taking a short break from the podcast, so it'll be a little while till
Yeah, congrats on the kid.
Thank you.
Nick's gonna be a daddy.
I am, so
Congratulations.
I got my next few months time occupied, but this has been awesome so far. I loved it.
Awesome. Well, we hope to have you back. Maybe we can have your kid on the show too when he's, when you're
yeah.
back. Hopefully he'll be here. Or
She,
sorry. She.
I'm going to train her in the arts of blue and dark magic.
Giving her a Tron deck for her birthday.
Yeah, that'll be her first toy.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks everybody for listening. This was episode 3 of Pop It Like It's Hot. As always, sponsored by RIW Hobbies and Games in Livonia, Michigan. We hope you tune in next week, and until then, we'll see you later. If you want to take a look at any of the decks we discussed on this week's episode, the links will be in the show notes, or you can check out the Twitch stream and see them there.
Pop it like it's hot. 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 Pop it like